so in 1775 he established the African Lodge number 459, which the so-called white men changed to African Lodge number 1 to hide the fact that there was already over 400 African lodges, or 458 to be exact. Plus that the Grand Lodge in England was a African lodge. Prince Henry Bay sent another charter after the Boston Tea Party secretly in 1784. This charter Big Ben Bay received, but was stolen on the day of Big Ben Bay's funeral. Keep in mind Benjamin Banneker was the right-hand man to President John Hanson, a Moor. In 1788 Banneker bought books and equipment to begin a more formal study of astronomy. Ben the genius during the following year, made calculating and correct prediction of a solar eclipse in 1789. In 1790 Banneker was hired by General George Washington and Andrew Ellicott to survey the land and map out a galactic layout of 10 by 10 square miles. Congress designated the location of the new capital on January 24, 1791. Banneker surveyed the 10-mile square tract of land and produced a base map of the area. Keep in mind George Washington and Benjamin Banneker go back a long ways. They lie and say George Washington was born in Westmoreland, Virginia. This is a lie, he was born in Barbados. Keep in mind Benjamin Banneker's mother was from Barbados. Banneker visited his mother people there and sometime would stay all summer. He met George Washington in 1748, Benjamin was 17 and George was 16. They met at Codrington College in Barbados. It was a state-of-the-art school built in 1745. Keep in mind George Washington is not his real name. His name is George Augustine of Barbados. He didn't get the name Washington until 1788. In 1788 90% of the people with the last name Washington was Moors black. Washington come from the land the Washita Native America control. Their land cover from Virginia to the Washita River in Texas. He needed the surname Washington added to his name to try and say he was born in America, but he was born in Barbados. George Augustine Washington House in Barbados is a historic house where the future 17th president and the first U.S. president, George Washington, stayed in this house from 1732 to 1751. He was born in this house, not in Amexem/America. When George was 6 in 1738 he was molested. As little George grew up he had a hard time getting past this. He was confused and psychologically affected by this. He was 19 years old when he and his half-brother, Lawrence Augustine, joined the British Army. 6 months later Lawrence Augustine became ill with tuberculosis. He died in 1752 at the age of 34. After his brother's death George was promoted to lieutenant under Major General Edward Braddock. Notice the hidden hand Hewitt is doing. Letting you know he is a Freemason. Who they nicknamed the British Bulldog before Winston Churchill. Edward Braddock was a devil. Churchill was a devil as well. Braddock and his brigade wiped out over 100,000 Moorish natives and took their land. Keep in mind us as Moors were being hustled under our nose. King George III hired the so-called white convicts as mercenary to serve as his army. Most of the so-called whites, who made it to high rank in our army, betrayed us. George, Braddock, and Churchill were all Knights of Templars. Churchill comes into play a little while later. Braddock was murdered as a pawn by the Knights of Templar to win the truth of the Lakota people. Edward Braddock slaughtered a lot of their people. The natives wanted his head, because of what he had did. The Templars knew about Abu Bakr's hidden gold on that land and the laboratory in an advanced cave system built by the Anunnaki where Abu Bakr hid all his gold. It also was advanced technology hidden down there. Some of the knights had children by some of the Lakota women. This was also a doorway to the center of the earth. The Templars set up an underground base there in 1832 to so-called protect the site. They have a base there till this very day. They made it, like a gold rush in the Black Hill, but it was really them finding Abu Bakr's gold which he hid all over that land and under the Black Hill, which they name Mount Rushmore. We will get to this later. Sweet George Augustine was groomed to be president by John Hanson and Benjamin Banneker, who were both the Moors. Why? That's a good question. They made up several people to steal Banneker credit. They made Prince Hall and Benjamin Franklin. They lied and said Benjamin Franklin was the first one to produce an almanac and a clock to cover up the fact that Benjamin Banneker Moore was the first one that produced these things in America. There was no Benjamin Franklin. On October 8, 1788, George Augustine changed his surname to Washington. He became the first president of the U.S. on April 30, 1789, not America. In 1789, Benjamin Banneker found a map and clue to a hidden treasure of the Knights Templar. He used George's visit to Trinity Church after his inauguration as a cover-up. This church is one of the oldest structures in New York, built in 1696 by British Moors. Trinity Church at 89 Broadway, New York, New York 10006 is a historic parish church in the Episcopal Diocese of New York, at the intersection of Wall Street and Broadway in the financial district of Lower Manhattan in New York City. The Moors who built this church were Coptic Christians. Benjamin found the stash gold of the Knights of Templar under this church. Some of this gold was used to start Wall Street in 1790 to 1792. Washington used some of this money to buy the 10 by 10 square miles to set up their new capital, now being called D.C. How did this gold get there? By way of a knight named Cortés. Hernán Cortés was a Spanish conquistador who led an expedition that caused the fall of the Aztec Empire and brought large portions of what is now mainland Mexico under the rule of the King of Castile in 1521. In 1519, Hernán Cortés and the rest of his goons and goblins landed in central Amexem. When the Aztecs seen him, they thought he was the return of Abu Bakr II, who had told them he would be back but never return. Yes, I know, right? They begin handing over gold to Cortés and his men. Cortés saw how nice they were, because they treated him like a god. They thought he was the return of Quetzalcoatl. They gave he and his men virgins and anything they wanted. You can only imagine how these devils took advantage of this. By 1521, Hernán Cortés had conquered the Aztec people. They were beating into speaking their conqueror's language, Spanish, which is Latin, Portuguese, and Greek. Latin was created by Moors. They had children by the women who they raped. These are the Italian-looking Mexicans. They started the Mexican mafia called the Lagim. These guys don't jack around. Also, after Cortés took over years later, many Italian immigrants came to Mexico. The gold that the Aztec gave to Cortés was tons. These so-called white boys who were Knights of Templar never seen so much gold. Hernán Cortés said, "This is too much gold for one king." So he and his knights took the gold and hid it on Oak Island, which is off the coast of Canada, Amexem/America. Oak Island is a 57-hectare privately owned island in Lunenburg County on the south shore of Nova Scotia, Canada. The tree-covered island is one of about 360 small islands in Mahone Bay and rises to a maximum of 11 meters above sea level. Many people were looking for this gold. In the 1700s, the Knights of Templar, in efforts to keep people from finding their stash, moved the gold to New York under Trinity Church, where it was found by Benjamin Banneker in 1789 using a hidden Templars map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. There was a lot of gold down there. They made a movie about it called National Treasure Hunt with Nicolas Cage, who is a direct descendant of Queen Victoria. He is also a Knights of Templar. This was split up. Some was taken to Nevada to Area 51 and hidden in an underground huge safe. Some was taken to the Vatican. Some was taken to England. Some was hidden under the World Trade Centers, which is part of the reason they knocked them down. Some was taken to Vallejo, California and hidden under a Masonic lodge underground. This city is protected by Freemasons. The African Grand Temple Lodge in Philly. In 1791, Big Ben Bay, in effort to reserve the craft in the original capital city of the Moors, Philadelphia. Keep in mind, Philadelphia is still the real capital, not D.C. Washington, D.C. is only 10 by 10 square miles, ruled by foreign opposition. I think you young people refer to them as the OPPs. Big Ben Bay set up a lodge in Philadelphia to oppose the foreign opposition who had took over their original Grand Lodge. In 1797 he joined the two lodges and made the one in Philadelphia the main African Grand Lodge. In 1806 after his death the so-called white men stepped in and removed the African off the Temple Lodge and changed it to Prince Hall, who they made up, to get rid of the African part. They lie and say Prince Hall died in 1807. See the cover-up. They say Prince Hall was a slave to a so-called white dude named Tanner William Hall. This is a lie. Moors were not slaves. Some Moors got kidnapped. Big Ben Bey never was a slave and the 14 men with him were never slaves. They had to make up Prince Hall to make it like the Moors, who were being now called Black Moor or black, and some Indians came from slavery. This is false. They lie and say he became free in 1770. We are on to your game now. They made it Prince Hall to say Prince Hall Freemasons come from slavery. This game has been running ever since. In 1792 Benjamin Banneker created his own almanac containing a tide table listing the methods for calculating the time of high water at 4 locations along the Chesapeake Bay, Cape Charles and Point Lookout, Virginia, Annapolis and Baltimore, Maryland. Later almanacs contain tables for making such calculations for those locations as well as for Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Halifax, Quebec, Hatteras, Nantucket, and other places. In 1801 Big Ben Bey later found out the secret about Abu Bakr's gold hidden in Black Hill. He had in his possession an encoded map to this treasure. Benjamin Banneker also kept a journal. In this journal he talks about the map. He talks about his connection with George Augustine, where they were college buddies in Barbados and that George was gay. He talks about 3 so-called white men, who were following him around since they had found the gold. He suspected them to be Knights of Templar. Benjamin Banneker knew he was being followed. So he hid the map. In 1806 after going for his early morning walk, he wasn't feeling good. He mysteriously died in his sleep on October 9, 1806. The same day of his funeral. The 3 white men ramshacked and looted his house log cabin, stealing all his paperwork and his journals. They then set the cabin on fire and burned it to the ground. This is the cover-up about Big Ben Bey.